I was born into a family where my mother was an artist. So the first thing I remember is sitting with her in an armchair, me sitting on the arm of the chair, and she's drawing. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating that you could make images show up just by doodling around on a piece of paper. So that was my first exposure to art. So when I was about 3, I announced to my family, I still remember doing this, that I was going to be an artist. And my mother was so happy, and my father was just beside himself thinking, oh no, this will never work. She'll never make any money. She'll never be happy. So that's where it all started. I grew up here in London for the most part, and I went to school here. In my high school, there were teachers of art. There's not always teachers of art in high schools now, but we had some wonderful ones, and I was lucky that way. And then when I went on to university, I first studied English literature and philosophy, and I really missed doing the art, so I went back to Beale and did some Beale artwork with Bert Klusman and Herb Harris and a few other people, and really enjoyed that experience while I was moving through other degrees. And my father thought it would be a great idea to get a law degree because I would have something to fall back on, and I wouldn't be so poor. But he was willing to pay for it, so I was willing to do it. And then he was doing a business degree at the end of his own career, so I did one along with him, which was an interesting experience to be in the same classroom with your father. So I eventually moved into the visual arts department at Western. I was a student there first, and I studied with Helmut Becker, and I got very interested in paper making and printmaking. And from there, I taught alongside Helmut for a few years, and then I moved into engineering, which is sort of a story in itself. Mm-hmm. In engineering, what happened was they called the faculty, our department, visual arts, and asked for someone to do a film for them for recruitment. They wanted to recruit students from all over the world. So I just happened to be there, and they said, can you run a video camera? And yes, I can. Can you edit? Yes, I know how to do that. So away I went, and I thought it would be a summer job. So I had 3 months. They handed me the budget and the camera and said, good luck, and just let me go. So I really had an exploration through engineering that summer, and I worked with some wonderful people. When I went to engineering, 80% of the professors were near the end of their careers. They were within 5 years of the end of their careers. Mm-hmm. So they were very open to the arts. They were very open to having an artist around. They weren't treating me like some kind of dancing monkey. They didn't understand. They had friends who were artists. They knew what I was up to, and they had a lot to offer in terms of ways of visualizing various experiments and so on, and different kinds of physical issues for their own work that I found interesting for my work. And then my contribution to them was really about visual literacy, because they were doing the strangest things, and it was because they had no background in visual literacy. So I was there in a helpful way, and they were there giving me opportunities that simply weren't available to visual arts students at the time, or visual artists generally. Well, there were a few things. I remember at one point the wind tunnel had a group of people from Japan there, and they were trying to sell them some offshore platforms on which to build cities. Because if you know Japan, you know there's no land left. Mm-hmm. So they weren't entirely crazy about the whole idea, the presentation. So all of a sudden I got a call in my office saying, can you come over here and talk to these people? And I didn't know much about the project, but I was able to describe to them visually how this was going to happen and what this would look like and feel like. And they became much more interested in the project because they had a lot of respect for artists and not as much for engineers. I mean, they had lots of engineers around, but they didn't know too many artists, and their culture is different insofar as there is that respect for artists that I don't think we find in our own. So from that point, I did things like flow visualization projects that some of my colleagues were doing, We made them look easier to read. We made the colors match the speed and that sort of thing. We introduced the psychology of color to what was going on in their experiments and how they would produce them, so that it was easier for the average person to understand when they saw a presentation what they were trying to show. So it was great being helpful and great being exposed to all those things. Well, I was accused of selling out. I was accused of leaving the security of the arts, or trying to do something that had nothing to do with the arts by some people. But there were other people like Jose Barrio-Garay, who was a professor in engineering or in visual arts, and Jose had seen this sort of thing before, and so he had some historical antecedents to show me and help me to understand what in fact I was doing. But generally you have to remember that back in the 80s people didn't even have computers on their desks, and I was going to a place where that was normal and expected. So what I was doing was unusual, to say the least. There was. I tend to be a very practical person. And at that time in the arts, there was a lot of art theory going around, to the point where they were stopping people in the studios from making art in favor of thinking about art theory. And that didn't sit well with me. For me, the art has to work. It has to work as either some kind of understanding of the world or some kind of way of exploring the world, learning about the world. So when I went over to engineering, that was exactly what they were doing. They were trying to understand the world, and sometimes they were doing it in a visual way. A lot of the times they were. And they were trying to get an answer to a specific question. They were trying to fix a problem. So very often when I'm sitting in my studio and I'm working, I'm dreaming up the problems, but I'm also dreaming up the ways to fix the problems. And when I'm working, I feel like I'm actually exploring and learning in the same way that an engineer does, or any other kind of intellectual who tries to learn about the world. It's a way of exploring rather than through words or through mathematics. I was doing it visually, and I continue to work that way. I think the impact, which was felt almost immediately because I became this poster girl for engineering when I went over there, engineering and art, was that science is not at one end and art is at the other. It's a matter of different people talking to each other and learning each other's language and being willing to learn each other's language. Now social media is so much a part of what we do that it's normal, and you probably can't imagine living without these things. But at the time it was seen as opposite ends of the spectrum, which in fact it isn't, because I met a lot of engineers who were doing watercolors and oil paintings and that sort of thing in their spare time. And I met a lot of artists who needed help with the engineering aspects of their work. Things like anchoring large sculptures because of wind loads in the boundary layer. They needed help, and they needed the help of an engineer. So that kind of cross-breeding was really a very positive aspect of what came out of it. And I think the impact of that can be seen everywhere today, because I don't think anybody in visual arts would have a problem asking an engineer what to do. And in fact, we did a few projects where Catherine Elliott Shaw and I did a project with visual arts and engineering where we created these bike racks on campus, and we were trying to answer engineering questions about how many bikes can you fit on that rack and keep it down so that it can't be stolen, but things like not using too much material because then it gets expensive. But then the art students were thinking about aesthetic issues. It's got to fit into the landscape or be distinct in the fact that it doesn't fit into the landscape and be noticeable. And different people were answering different questions, but they were working together to answer those questions. And I think we got some good results on that project. You can see them on the campus. I had to learn to speak in the way that they understood the language. I couldn't speak about issues related to visual arts in ways that they couldn't access. So I was sort of the go-between between those two. But I think most of my colleagues were very helpful and interested, to the point where they would phone me and say, oh, I've got this new thing in my laboratory, will you come and look at it? And give me opportunities like that. So they were very good that way. But one of the challenges was I was the only female professor for many years in engineering. Some would come for a term and leave, but by the time I left, we had 10 professors who were female. So that among 90 professors, that's a sort of a critical mass. We could make our feelings known, our ideas known. But at first it wasn't at all that way. So those were challenges, but only insofar as I needed to learn to communicate with them in a way that they could understand. I'm proud of the garden behind engineering by the Claudette McKee Lassonde Pavilion. I'm proud of that garden because it's not just a sustainable development. People talk about sustainable development all the time, and I taught that concept in environmental engineering when I was teaching. But it's more than that. It actually helps the soil and the air and everything that goes through there be healthier. It actually improves the situation. So I called it a biodynamic garden because it actually made life more dynamic. It invited in birds and bees and raccoons and rabbits and all kinds of things into that space. And it offered a space where people could go out and instantly be with native plants. There's no maintenance for that garden. And sit on rocks instead of seats, and really enjoy being one with the environment. It also kept the environment on people's minds, so that when they were thinking about a project, they were not just thinking about how much money can I make on this project. They're thinking about, what do I have to take out of the environment? How am I treating it, and how am I going to return it to the environment? So it was a master lesson on that sort of thinking, and I'm very proud that it's there. The garden I did last year at St. George's, behind St. George's, is a pollinator's garden. We started with an acre of lawn, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out what to do with that lawn for a long time, because an aquifer runs under it that is perhaps toxic. Depends on who you talk to, but I wasn't willing to grow food or a community garden or anything like that. But I thought, with the problems with losing honeybees and having fewer and fewer places in the city for pollinators to live and thrive, this space could be used for that. So we tore it up and got rid of the grass and put in some native plants, and right away we heard this loud buzzing sound. The pollinators had found it. It was wonderful, and deer come up from the river, and we have a huge gopher. We have rabbits. We have all kinds of things that are living in that garden, and people are moving through that garden every day and seeing native plants that perhaps they didn't know existed, never had exposure to them. I will experiment with anything I can get my hands on, to be honest, but the basic thing for everything is drawing, and I love to draw. When I was at Beal-Art, I was drawing about 30 hours a week. It was serious. We drew all day, we drew all evening. It was wonderful. And I still go back to that. It's the basis for everything. I love paper making. I love print making. I have a 5-ton press in my studio, but you have to be able to draw to do these things, and that's what I always go back to. I'm still fascinated by drawing, by people that can draw and people that have a reaction when they see you drawing out in public. People are always amazed by it. When I initially went over to engineering, it was partly through the sponsorship of the McIntosh Gallery, and then over the years, Catherine Elliott Shaw and I have worked together on a number of different projects, but one of them was called Sacred Spaces. And my husband was putting together the General Assembly for the Presbyterian Church of Canada, and he was having it at Western. He's a Presbyterian minister. And part of that is getting people together to decide policies for the church and so on. But it's also to showcase the campus and showcase the city and so on. So we decided that, Catherine and I, that we would show off a copy of the King James Bible, because it was the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible, and the archives at Western have one. And I was at the time the chair of the archives committee. So we got that over to the McIntosh, and then we started selecting pieces out of the permanent collection that would help people to come in from their very busy day and meditate, or in religious terms you would say they were praying, or they were thinking about issues related to their religion and the governing of their religion. But we wanted to create a space that was warm and inviting and peaceful, meditative. And I think we managed it, because they're still talking about this. They're still talking about at the next General Assembly, are we going to have an art show? Because people came in and really enjoyed the time that they spent in the gallery with the works that we chose. Some of them were quite challenging, the show pieces, the artwork, but some of them were very easy to get along with, if you will, and to learn and to understand. So it was a very important show for the church at that moment, to have a space on the campus at Western where we could have that kind of show and have that kind of group visiting our campus. Yeah, I think it's an extension of being an artist for me. Part of what you do when you've finished making the art is getting it out there in the world. And part of what you do is you're sort of a diplomat for the arts. You help people who are not artists or not involved in the arts community to understand our culture and understand how it's informed and how it comes about, and how important it is to people to have the arts in their lives. So curating is part of that for me. When I'm alone in the studio, I'm not thinking about who's going to see the work. I'm not thinking about how the work is going to function in the world. I'm really thinking about what I'm exploring myself and what I'm interested in, and whether the work is successful depends on issues that have purely to do with me. But when I take that work out into the world, that's a different dynamic completely. And I'm very interested in how people interact with artworks and what they see that I don't see when I've made the piece. Even they're looking at pieces of art and telling me what it's about, and I didn't intend that or whatever. But it's the richness that viewers can add to the artwork that's quite interesting to me. Art makes you happy. Art is good. Art is positive. Art is something that can make you peaceful, can make you calm, can help you get excited about other ideas, or even political ideas, or anything that the artist wants to put in there can guide you in the way that you're thinking about issues. But for me, it's something that adds a richness to life that wouldn't be there. I can't imagine having gone through high school without the arts. I can't imagine being in the world without the arts. It's so important. It enriches your life, it enriches your spiritual life as well as your visual understanding of things. It is important for your intellectual development. All of those things are based on art. There has to be art. Art is happy for me. I suppose it's a willingness to look at other people's ways of learning about the world and incorporating that into your artwork. Not being willing to see barriers. The people that I worked with at the time that I left visual arts saw a lot of barriers to going to engineering, but I didn't see those barriers, and they may have been there, but I ignored them. And I think I would encourage young people to really think about the arts as an integral way of learning about the world. when I was teaching in engineering, I taught for 26 years in engineering. I always taught them about the arts, about different ways of thinking, because you can get stuck in a rut, you can get stuck in a box, and people will tell you, oh, you're not good at art, so you have to become a mathematician or something like that. It doesn't make any sense to me. You have the ability to look at everything. So I encouraged my students to do that. And I had students who studied film and engineering and visual arts and engineering and studied all kinds of combinations that you wouldn't think of. But I was able to show them historical antecedents of engineers who were artists in their part-time and people around us that were artists by having shows of engineering art students and engineering faculty and staff. And it helped them to break down those barriers. So if I have some kind of legacy to the arts community, I hope it's that there are no barriers. Break down those barriers. Don't worry about what other people think is art. If your intention is to make art, then you will make art. It doesn't matter if you're standing in a faculty of engineering or you're in a studio. You're doing what you wish to do. So that's what makes it important. Art is a very interesting thing. I read a lot of biographies of artists, and it's very interesting because it's a constant pull, at least for me, between being alone in my studio and don't bother me, and I can get quite cranky if I'm bothered, to being out in the world and being part of an art community, part of a greater community, and certainly being part of Western's community in teaching and showing people what I was up to. So there's this constant pull between the social and being alone. And I think right now with all of the social media out there, there's a lot of social. But I wonder if people that are much younger than me have enough time to be alone, to think, to create art, to be alone in themselves without outside things bothering them. So that's a constant pull for me, back and forth. And the important thing is to balance that, to have some of each, not to be a hermit in my studio, and also not to be spending so much time in social situations that I don't have time to work on the artwork. So it's a balance for me. The next one. It's always the next one for me. I decided when I left Western to take some time to take care of myself and take care of being in the studio. And I decided not to exhibit for a while, maybe 5 years, which is a fair chunk of time. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking forward to the time when people will be able to see what I did in those 5 years and see what I'm thinking about and how I'm expressing that. That will be interesting. So I think my favorite show is always what I'm working on next, and I hope it continues that way my whole life. I hope I'm always working on something else, so that my mind is stimulated and my intellectual being is still growing. So yeah, in the past I've had interesting shows for what I was thinking about at the time, but in the future, that's more what I'm interested in right now. I don't have the pressures that I had when I was younger, when I had to show, I had to sell. Mm-hmm. I don't have those pressures anymore, so I have the time to think and not worry about those kinds of commitments. I'm not making any commitment. So when there's a reasonable body of work and I wish to show it, I'll show it. But I gave myself a sort of artificial deadline of 5 years. And then we'll see what happens. Well, when I met my husband, he had posters hanging in his house. And I'm a real snob. I walk into someone's house and I'm looking for art. And if I don't see art, then I feel bad for these people. I want to see art. And he really didn't have any. And I don't know if it was the exposure to me or just the fact that he was growing up and growing older, and he had interest in it, but he's become quite a connoisseur of art. He's able to walk into a room and see the best piece available, and he's able to get it at a darn good price. He's amazing. So he's been able to give me some interesting gifts over the years, and we have quite a collection. Before I was married to my husband, I collected almost always images of women. I really enjoy images of women, whether they're old-fashioned debut pictures, when they were debuting in society. I have portraits like that. Or if they were just pictures of models that someone chose to draw for whatever reason, or paint. I'm very interested in the figure in drawing, and also very interested in how women are depicted in art. So that was the basis of my collection, but it's grown a great deal since then, because my husband's interested in all kinds of things. Keith will buy landscapes, and he'll buy still lifes, and he buys all kinds of things because it interests him. So he's very good at it. I don't know if that's because he lives with an artist or because he's got his own interests, but he's become very good at it. If you can look at good pieces of art every day, I think that's wonderful. It enriches your life. So that's why we have so much art spread around the house. It's under beds, it's in cupboards, it's not all on the wall, but it's there, and we keep moving it around so that we don't get so used to it that it becomes wallpaper and we don't see it anymore. And that is a danger in somebody's permanent collection at home. But we keep adding to it and changing it, and we literally have a little process that we go through when we get a new piece of art. We have it all framed up, and we walk around the house to see where it wants to live. And then you just find a spot that makes sense, and you take down whatever's there, or if you have to arrange things that are around it, we do that. But the collection is growing and changing as we grow and change. So it's a very positive thing for us. We don't usually get rid of any art. There have been only, I can think of 2 instances where we actually sold pieces of art that were not interesting to us anymore. But for the most part, we keep what we buy. We just don't have enough wall space to show it all.